Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The room was warm with the glow of candlelight, the air filled with the quiet hum of conversation and the distant clinking of silverware against fine china, the kind of atmosphere that made everything feel surreal, as if I had somehow stepped into the perfect wedding scene from a movie. I sat beside Daniel, my fingers resting lightly against the stem of my champagne glass, my heart still buzzing with the joy of the day, with the way everything had fallen into place exactly as I had imagined. The dress, the venue, the flowers, the way he had looked at me when I walked down the aisle, every single moment had been flawless, a dream brought to life in a way I hadn't thought possible. But then, my mother stood up, and just like that, the warmth in my chest began to flicker, the familiar tension settling deep in my bones before she had even spoken a single word. She smiled at the guests, raising her glass with the practiced grace of someone who had spent her life commanding attention, her presence alone enough to shift the energy in the room, to make people straighten in their chairs, to make eyes turn toward her expectantly. She had always had a way of making herself the center of every occasion, of steering conversations in whatever direction she pleased, of ensuring that even in moments that weren't about her, she still held the reins. Well, she began, her voice smooth, dripping with the kind of artificial warmth that only people who really knew her could recognize as calculated. What a beautiful night, what a wonderful celebration, and what a joy it is to witness my daughter start this new chapter of her life. She paused, letting the words settle, allowing the illusion of sentimentality to take hold before she continued. Of course, as a mother, nothing makes me prouder than seeing my children succeed, than watching them grow into incredible people, than knowing I had a hand in shaping who they've become. I felt Daniel's fingers brush against my knee beneath the table, a silent reassurance, a quiet acknowledgement that he could feel it too, that this speech wasn't about me. Now, she went on, a small, knowing smile pulling at the corners of her lips. Speaking of success, I can't go without mentioning my son, Ryan, who has made all of us so proud with everything he's accomplished. It's not every day that a mother gets to say her son is a true example of ambition, of drive, of what it really means to build something great. I stared at her, my grip tightening around my champagne flute, the weight of her words pressing down on my chest in a way that felt both familiar and unbearable, the way it always did when she made it clear, without ever needing to say it outright, who she truly considered the shining star of the family. The guests murmured politely, some nodding along, others shifting awkwardly in their seats, sensing the shift in tone, the way this speech at my wedding, during my celebration, had turned into something entirely different, something that wasn't about me at all. Ryan, seated a few tables away, leaned back in his chair, a smug smile playing on his lips, his expression unreadable but filled with the kind of confidence that came from always being put on a pedestal, from never having to prove himself because our mother had already decided he was untouchable. I felt Daniel shift beside me, his movements slow, deliberate, the kind of controlled stillness that I had come to recognize as something far more dangerous than anger. He reached for his champagne glass, lifting it to his lips, taking a slow sip before setting it down with careful precision, his fingers tapping lightly against the stem as he finally spoke. "That's funny," he said, his voice smooth, casual, carrying just enough weight that the room immediately fell silent. "Because Ryan asked me for a job last week." The shift in the room was instant, a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the crowd, the scraping of a chair against the floor as someone shifted uncomfortably, the sudden, almost painful stillness that followed in the wake of his words. My mother's smile froze in place, her fingers tightening around the base of her glass as if she had just realized she had made a terrible mistake, as if the floor beneath her had suddenly turned unsteady. I turned my head just slightly, just enough to see Ryan's face, to watch the color drain from his cheeks, to see the way his eyes darted toward my mother, toward the guests, toward me, searching for something, a way out, an explanation, an excuse. But there was nothing he could say, nothing that could erase the words Daniel had just spoken, Nothing that could undo the way every single person in that room had just seen his carefully crafted image crack wide open. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on all of us as my mother struggled to recover, as Ryan looked like he wanted to disappear. As the once smug confidence that had been radiating off him only moments ago crumbled into something unrecognizable. I sat there, my heartbeat steady, my breathing even, my chest rising and falling with a sense of calm that I hadn't expected, a realization settling deep into my bones with a clarity that felt almost intoxicating. This wasn't over. This was only the beginning. The morning after the wedding, I woke up to the kind of peace that felt earned, the kind of quiet that settled deep into my bones, the kind of satisfaction that lingered long after the final guests had gone home. I stretched beneath the soft sheets, feeling the warmth of Daniel's body beside me, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, knowing that last night had shifted something unspoken, something that had been waiting to snap for years. For the first time in my life, I had watched Ryan's carefully constructed mask slip, had seen the panic in his eyes, had witnessed my mother's smile falter, her confidence waver, her perfect illusion shatter in real time. But the satisfaction didn't last long, because even as I lay there in the quiet glow of the morning, a thought began to take root in my mind, something gnawing, something unsettled, something that told me last night wasn't just an isolated moment. It was the beginning of something much, much bigger. By the time I had poured my first cup of coffee, my phone was already lighting up with messages, the group chats buzzing with whispers, the kind of speculation that only happens after something scandalous. The kind of slow-burning gossip that spreads like wildfire through a family that pretends it doesn't thrive on drama. A cousin I barely spoke to had sent a text that was almost too eager, asking if it was really true, if Ryan had really asked Daniel for a job, if my brother, the so-called golden child, the family's success story, the one my mother had spent years worshipping, was actually struggling. I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the keyboard, debating how much I should say, how much I should reveal, how much I should let them wonder on their own. But then another message came through, this time from an aunt who had always been just a little too invested in Ryan's supposed rise to success, and her words made something click in my mind, something sharp, something dangerous. Well, she had typed, her words casual but laced with something close to amusement. I guess not everything is as perfect as it seems. That was the moment I realized I needed to dig deeper, that last night had only been a small crack in the foundation of Ryan's so-called empire, that there was more beneath the surface, that the story he had been feeding our family for years wasn't the whole truth. And if there was one thing I had learned growing up in a house where lies were dressed up as reality, it was that cracks always get bigger, no matter how desperately you try to cover them up. I started small, keeping it subtle, asking seemingly innocent questions, poking just hard enough to make people slip, to make them reveal things they didn't even realize they were saying. I reached out to old acquaintances, former colleagues of Ryan's, people who had once sung his praises, but now hesitated when I brought up his name, their voices dipping into something less certain, something more reserved. It didn't take long before the picture began to form, before the gaps in his story became impossible to ignore, before I saw the truth for what it really was. Ryan wasn't the successful businessman he had always pretended to be. His company, the one my mother loved to brag about at family gatherings, the one she claimed had been thriving for years, was actually bleeding money at an alarming rate, barely staying afloat, one bad investment away from complete financial ruin. He had made risky deals, had overpromised on projects that never saw completion, had borrowed more than he could ever afford to pay back, all while keeping up the appearance of wealth, of stability, of effortless success. And the worst part? He had been using our mother as a personal safety net, relying on her money, her influence, her unwavering belief in him to keep the illusion alive, knowing that as long as she saw him as the perfect son, she would do anything, even risk her own financial security, to protect him. The realization sent a slow, steady pulse of satisfaction through me, but beneath that, there was something else, something bitter, something that made my stomach twist with an emotion I didn't want to name. She had chosen him. Again and again, my mother had chosen Ryan, had defended him, had pushed me aside every time I accomplished something, just so she could place him on a pedestal he had never earned. And now, here she was, scrambling to keep his house of cards from collapsing, blindly throwing money at a sinking ship while I, the daughter she had ignored, the one she had dismissed, the one she had spent years treating as if I were invisible, had built something real. Something solid, something that couldn't be taken away from me. But the most interesting thing I found, the thing that made my breath hitch, the thing that made everything snap into place, was the fact that Ryan had already gone to her for help before the wedding, had begged her to bail him out one more time, had tried to convince her to pull from her savings, to refinance her home, to do whatever it took to cover his debts just long enough for him to figure out his next move. And for the first time in his entire life, she had hesitated. Because even she was starting to see the truth. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding, my hands steady, my mind racing with possibilities, with plans, with the slow, creeping realization that this was my moment. I had spent my entire life being pushed to the background, being made to feel like my accomplishments weren't enough, like I would never be as good, as important, as worthy as Ryan. But now, for the first time, he was slipping, and I was watching in real time as the foundation he had built his life on began to crumble beneath him. And the best part? I hadn't even done anything yet. I had spent my entire life watching Ryan play the role of the golden child, watching as he soaked up every ounce of praise, every bit of admiration, every unearned advantage that our mother had placed at his feet like an offering. I had seen the way she beamed whenever he walked into a room, how she spoke about him in glowing terms to anyone who would listen, how she refused to acknowledge any of his mistakes while making sure that every single one of mine was held under a microscope. For years, I had accepted it, had learned to swallow the bitterness, had forced myself to believe that proving myself to her wasn't worth the effort, that I didn't need her approval, that I could build something for myself without her validation. But now, as I sat back and watched the cracks in Ryan's perfect life widen into something irreversible, something undeniable, something deliciously satisfying, I realized that I had been given a rare opportunity, the chance to make everyone else see the truth. I didn't have to lie, didn't have to fabricate some elaborate story to bring him down, didn't have to manipulate anyone into believing what I already knew. All I had to do was give people the right information at the right time and let them do the work for me. So I played the role I had spent a lifetime perfecting, the supportive, caring sister, the one who only wanted what was best for her brother, the one who asked all the right questions, who expressed just the right amount of concern, who made it seem as though I was merely a helpless bystander caught in the unfortunate mess that Ryan had created. It started small, just a few casual conversations here and there, strategically placed words dropped into family gatherings, little bits of truth slipped into discussions where I knew they would spread like wildfire. When an aunt asked me about Ryan's business, I sighed, giving a soft, hesitant smile, the kind that looked just a little too forced to be real, and murmured something about how I wasn't sure what was going on, how he had been under so much stress lately. How he had been working so hard, but things hadn't quite gone the way he planned. I saw the way her eyebrows lifted just slightly, the way her expression shifted into something speculative, the way she mentally filed the information away to be shared later. At another family dinner, when someone mentioned Ryan's supposed success, I tilted my head, just barely, a tiny movement that made it seem as if I wasn't sure whether I should say anything at all, before offering a quiet, "Oh, I thought he was looking for a new job." Daniel mentioned something about it the other day. It was a simple statement, innocent on the surface, but I watched as the room stilled for just a moment, as the words settled, as the weight of what I had just suggested rippled through the people seated around me. And it worked. The whispers started spreading faster than I had expected, curiosity morphing into doubt, admiration shifting into something closer to concern, blind faith crumbling beneath the weight of reality. The family that had once held Ryan in such high regard, that had believed every word our mother had ever said about his brilliance, his ambition, his unstoppable success, was now starting to see the holes in his story, the gaps in his image, the undeniable truth that had been hidden for years. And the best part was that Ryan had no idea it was happening, not until it was too late. I saw it in the way his confidence began to waver, in the way his once effortless charm started to feel rehearsed, in the way he became more defensive, more irritable, more desperate to control the narrative. He started avoiding family gatherings, claiming he was busy, making excuses, trying to dodge the questions that had started to follow him wherever he went. But avoidance wasn't enough, not when the people who had once admired him were now questioning everything they thought they knew. Then came the moment that I had been waiting for, the one that confirmed just how much ground Ryan had lost, just how far his golden image had fallen. I was sitting in the living room of an older relative's house, sipping tea, surrounded by family members who had spent years singing Ryan's praises, when someone finally said it out loud. "I mean," my uncle murmured, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair, his voice laced with something that almost sounded like disappointment. "If he's really doing as well as your mother says, then why does he need so much help?" The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded, the first real verbal acknowledgement that Ryan wasn't who he had always claimed to be, that the carefully constructed illusion was finally starting to collapse. And all I had to do, was sit there, take a slow sip of my tea, and offer the smallest, most unreadable smile as if to say, "I have no idea, Uncle Rob. You tell me." But just as I thought things couldn't get any better, just as I was reveling in the slow unraveling of everything Ryan had built his life on, I stumbled upon something even bigger, something that made my blood run cold, something that shifted this game from a quiet, controlled dismantling to something far more dangerous. Ryan hadn't just been relying on our mother for financial help, he had been stealing from her. I found it almost by accident, hidden in plain sight, buried beneath emails and transaction records and frantic late-night messages that reeked of desperation, the kind that revealed just how deep his financial troubles really went. He had used her accounts, had moved money without her knowledge, had taken advantage of her unwavering loyalty, knowing that she would cover for him, knowing that she would never, ever believe that he would betray her like this. And the best part? She didn't even know yet. I sat back, staring at the screen, my heart pounding, my mind racing with the weight of this revelation, realizing that this had never just been about exposing Ryan for what he was. It was about watching the last person still standing in his corner realize the truth for herself. Because when my mother found out that her perfect son had been robbing her blind, when she realized that the one person she had trusted, the one child she had chosen, the one person she had sacrificed everything for had been the one to betray her the most, that was when everything would finally fall apart. Ryan had spent his entire life walking through the world with an unshakable sense of entitlement, a quiet, simmering confidence that no matter what mistakes he made, no matter how reckless or selfish or careless he was, there would always be someone there to clean up his mess, to smooth over the damage, to shield him from the consequences he refused to acknowledge. He had built his entire existence on a foundation of blind faith, secure in the knowledge that our mother would always be in his corner, that she would always find a way to excuse his failures, that she would always convince herself that he was still the son she had always believed him to be. But for the first time in his life, the cracks in that foundation had become too deep to ignore, the weight of his failures too heavy to keep hidden. The carefully constructed illusion of his success collapsing under the pressure of a truth that was no longer just whispered behind closed doors, it was now out in the open for everyone to see. It started with the rumors, the hushed conversations at family gatherings, the raised eyebrows when Ryan walked into the room, the way people began questioning the stories he had spent years feeding them, the ones they had once believed without hesitation. Then came the fallout, the slow but inevitable unraveling of his so-called empire, the whispers turning into open discussions, the speculation transforming into undeniable fact. Business deals that had once seemed promising fell apart overnight, clients who had once trusted him started pulling away, people who had once sung his praises now spoke about him in tones laced with disappointment, skepticism, and something dangerously close to pity. And through it all, our mother fought to hold on, to push back against reality, to convince herself that none of it was true, that people were just exaggerating, that Ryan was still the same man she had always believed him to be. But the problem with blind loyalty is that it only works as long as you never see the truth for what it is. I found her in the kitchen one evening, standing by the sink, staring out the window with the kind of expression that told me she was already lost in thought, already trying to piece together the parts of this story in a way that made sense, already trying to convince herself that she had not spent her entire life backing the wrong child. The house felt different now, quieter, heavier, filled with the kind of tension that had been missing for so many years, the kind that only comes when a person is forced to acknowledge something they've spent their whole life running from. "You knew, didn't you?" I said finally, breaking the silence, watching as she tensed slightly, her shoulders stiffening, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "Some part of you always knew that this was going to happen, but you just didn't want to believe it." She didn't turn around, didn't look at me, didn't even pretend to deny it right away. Instead, she let out a slow breath, the kind that felt like defeat, the kind that carried the weight of years of willful ignorance finally catching up with her. "Ryan just needed a little more time," she murmured, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it before, her usual sharpness dulling into something that almost sounded small. "He just needed a chance to fix things." I let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking my head, unable to hide the bitterness laced in my voice. "And how many times have you told yourself that?" I asked, crossing my arms, my gaze never leaving her. "How many times have you bailed him out, covered for him, made excuses, and convinced yourself that he was one step away from finally proving you right? How long did you expect the rest of us to pretend along with you?" She turned then, finally meeting my eyes, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in her expression that I had never seen before: uncertainty, regret, something dangerously close to guilt. She opened her mouth, as if she wanted to say something, as if she wanted to fight back, to defend him the way she always had, but this time, the words didn't come. I could have left it at that, could have let the silence stretch between us, could have walked away and let her sit with the realization that she had built her entire identity around protecting someone who never deserved it. But I had spent too many years watching her overlook me, too many years listening to her sing Ryan's praises while acting as if I was just a background character in my own family. "You had a daughter, too," I said, my voice even, measured, calm in a way that made it impossible for her to mistake it for anything other than the truth. "But you were too busy propping up Ryan to see her." Something flickered across her face then, something raw, something close to pain, something that told me she knew I was right but couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. And maybe, if she had admitted it then, if she had looked at me and said she was sorry, that she had been wrong, that she had wasted so many years trying to make Ryan into something he would never be, maybe things could have ended differently. But she didn't. She just stood there, silent, her lips pressing together, her jaw tightening, her eyes flicking away from mine as if she couldn't bear to look at me any longer. And in that moment, I realized that she wasn't ready to face the truth. Not yet, not fully, not in the way she needed to. But she would. Because I had one final move left to make, one last piece of the puzzle to set into place, one final nail to hammer into the coffin of the perfect image she had spent her entire life protecting. I took a slow step forward, reaching into my bag, pulling out a crisp, white envelope, the contents inside holding the final truth she had been avoiding for so long. I placed it on the counter beside her, my fingers tapping lightly against the edge before I stepped back, watching as she stared at it, her brow furrowing, her breathing uneven. "Dinner," I said simply, my tone casual, almost indifferent, the way a person speaks when they already know the outcome of a conversation before it even begins. "Tomorrow night. You and Ryan. My treat." Her eyes snapped up to meet mine again, wide with something that almost resembled fear, and I offered her a slow, unreadable smile before turning on my heel and walking toward the door. Because tomorrow night, at that dinner table, she was finally going to see her son for what he really was. And there would be no more pretending after that. The restaurant was dimly lit, the kind of place where everything was meant to feel intimate and refined, the kind of setting where people spoke in hushed tones and where bad news felt heavier, more suffocating, more impossible to escape. I sat at the table, my fingers lightly tracing the rim of my wine glass, watching the door, waiting for the moment when my mother and Ryan would walk in, completely unaware that tonight would be the night everything they had built, everything they had convinced themselves was true, would finally come crashing down around them. Daniel sat beside me, his expression unreadable, his presence steady, a quiet but undeniable reminder that I wasn't alone in this, that I had won long before they even realized they were playing the game. I didn't have to wait long before I saw them enter, my mother walking with the same poise and grace she had always carried herself with, the kind that made her seem untouchable, the kind that had fooled so many people into believing that she was a woman who never made mistakes. Ryan followed close behind her, his confidence visibly shaken but still intact, still clinging to the last remnants of whatever self-importance he had left, still pretending that he wasn't standing on the edge of ruin with nowhere left to go. The moment they reached the table, I could see the hesitation in my mother's eyes, the way she was trying to decipher what this dinner was really about, the way she looked at me as if she already knew, deep down, that I was about to do something that she wouldn't be able to undo. But Ryan, in all his arrogance, in all his blind, unshakable faith in himself, sat down with a smirk, with that same entitled expression he had worn his entire life, the one that told me he still believed, somehow, that he could talk his way out of this. I let them settle in, let the tension build, let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable before I finally spoke, my voice smooth, casual, laced with the kind of controlled amusement that I knew would make Ryan squirm. I wanted to do this in a place where we could all be civil, I said, tilting my head slightly as I watched him, my eyes locked onto his, unblinking, unwavering, making it clear that whatever illusion of control he thought he had was about to disappear. Ryan scoffed, rolling his eyes as he leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the table, trying desperately to maintain the same confidence that had carried him through life. The same confidence that had always convinced our mother to stand by him no matter how many times he failed. "Oh, come on, Liv," he said, letting out a breathy laugh, shaking his head like I was being ridiculous. "If this is about all the little rumors floating around, you don't need to worry. Everything is under control." I raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of my wine, savoring the way his words rang hollow, the way he didn't even believe them himself. "Is that right?" I murmured, setting my glass down carefully, my fingers tapping against the stem as I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, the one filled with every piece of evidence, every document, every receipt, every undeniable, irrefutable fact that would bury him for good. I slid it across the table, watching as his smirk faltered, watching as my mother's hand hesitated before reaching for it, watching as the moment of realization hit them both like a freight train. I waited. I watched. And then, finally, my mother opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages, her breath hitching, her fingers tightening around the paper as she took in the worst betrayal of her life. Ryan had been using her name to take out loans. Ryan had forged her signature on financial documents. Ryan had been draining her accounts, ruining her credit, taking everything she had worked for and using it to keep his illusion of success alive. She let out a slow, shuddering breath, her eyes darting up to meet his, searching for an explanation, for a way to make sense of the unforgivable, for a reason to still defend him. "Ryan," she whispered, and for the first time, I heard something in her voice that I had never heard before when she spoke to him, fear. But Ryan? Ryan didn't have an excuse this time. He opened his mouth, closed it again, his face paling, his jaw tightening, his fingers clenching into fists against the table, trapped, cornered, completely out of ways to spin this into anything other than what it was, the moment he lost everything. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, my voice soft, almost gentle, as I delivered the final blow. "And the best part?" I said, my lips curving into a slow smile, savoring the way he flinched before I even finished. "Daniel and I, We bought out your company last week. Ryan froze, his entire body going stiff, his breathing uneven, his hands shaking as he processed the words, as the reality of what I had just said sank in deep enough to shatter whatever delusions he had left. You're lying, he choked out, shaking his head, his voice raw, desperate, pleading with himself more than with me, as if denying it would somehow make it untrue. Daniel exhaled, taking a slow sip of his drink, his voice calm, unaffected, ruthlessly matter-of-fact. Nope, he said simply, setting his glass down with a soft clink. It was a terrible investment, but hey, we figured it'd be fun to watch you fall. My mother let out a sharp breath, her head snapping toward Ryan, her eyes wide, wild, filled with the slow, creeping horror of someone realizing they had spent their entire life betting on the wrong horse. And in that moment, for the first time in my entire life, I watched my mother look at Ryan the same way she had always looked at me, with disappointment. It should have felt like victory. It should have felt like justice. But as I sat there, watching the two of them crumble beneath the weight of their own choices, watching the realization settle into their bones, watching the final, irreversible collapse of everything they had once believed to be true, I felt something else creep in. Something bitter. Something hollow. I stood, smoothing my dress, my fingers steady, my heart not quite as light as I thought it would be, my voice barely above a whisper as I looked at them one last time. Was it worth it? I murmured, my words meant for no one but myself. And as I turned, as I walked away from them for good, as I stepped into the night knowing that I had finally won, I realized that I wasn't sure if I had ever really lost to begin with.